welcome once again to Caleb Likes Books. Today I have another book review for you, and that is for The Hero of Ages by Brandon Sanderson, the third book in the original Mistborn trilogy, otherwise known as Mistborn Era 1. I've been working on rereading this trilogy for a few months now. I read, I think the first book back in July? Maybe June or July, and then Well of Ascension shortly thereafter, about a month later. I just haven't got around to reading Hero of Ages yet, but I finally did recently. And I've been very excited to reread this trilogy for a while, because this was what got me into Sanderson, it's what got me into the Cosmere and all that stuff, and is kind of the first piece of fantasy, as an adult anyway. I read The Chronicles of Narnia as a kid, and it really did this for me as well, but the first piece of adult fantasy that I read that like really hit me, really resonated with me, and Sanderson since then has done that on several other occasions with things like the Stormlight Archive and Warbreaker and all those kinds of things. But the Mistborn trilogy was the first adult fantasy thing that I read that I was just like super duper into. And so I was very excited to reread the trilogy. Loved the first two books as I revisited them. I have reviews for them on the channel. You can go watch those if you would like. And so I was very excited to revisit The Hero of Ages, because I remembered this being a fantastic conclusion with some of my favorite character arcs and stuff, and maybe being my least favorite book in the trilogy, but still being a really great one. I absolutely loved my time revisiting this book. I still might put it as my least favorite of the trilogy, but it's honestly kind of hard to say with the Mistborn trilogy, because to spoil my final rating for this book, I would give all three of these books like a 10 out of 10, so it's kind of hard for me to really pick a least favorite, but it's still like a phenomenal book, and I absolutely loved my time with it. So to get into the good stuff with this book, of which there's pretty much everything I have to say about this book is positive. I have like no negative points to really go into with this book, other than the fact that maybe it's a little slow in the beginning, but that doesn't really bother me all that much because I think it's still enjoyable. First things first is the character stuff in this book is really good. And one thing I was interested in with rereads in general, but especially with the Mistborn books, is seeing how my perspective on these books would change maybe a little bit rereading them. Like if there's anything different that I would really enjoy that was a little bit less exciting to me the first time around, or if I'd pick up on things which that also like picked up on so much foreshadowing and things, like not probably all of it, but there's so many little things that are just so much fun to find on a reread, which I'll probably talk about again in a minute if I think of it. The character stuff, the first time around reading this book, I was super into Sazed. Sazed was my favorite character in the trilogy the first time around. Still one of my favorite characters in the trilogy. Don't know if I'd say he's my number one. That's become harder for me to say as I've reread this trilogy, because Vin and Elend, and even Kelsier as well, all are characters that I love now. Even more than I did the first time, which goes for pretty much everything to do with this trilogy. But I loved Sazed in this book the first time around. I still loved him this time around. I really loved his arc of kind of, in the second book, kind of losing his faith a bit and kind of really struggling with that in this book. And his arc across this book and where he ends up in this book is amazing, and just such a great resolution to his character arc. I can't say enough good things about it, but I'm not going to say all those things because I'm not going to get into spoilers in this review. But if you've read this book, you know what I'm talking about. Like, his arc is amazing. But the first time I read this book, he was the standout for me. Whereas the kind of opposite of that for me was Spook. Spook in the first couple books, he was kind of the errand boy. He was the one that kind of the group would send off to just kind of do stuff for them, you know, just random errands and things like that. You know, go grab me a drink or whatever. But in this book, he has a very prominent arc. He's probably, I would say, second to Sazed and Vin. Probably, I would say, the third most important character in terms of, like, his arc in this book, at least to me. His arc in this book is amazing. I loved him. I found him such a more compelling character than I did the first time around. The first time around, he was like the one plot line that I wasn't really that into, and he's a large part of the reason why the first time I read this book, I thought like the first half was just, good but not amazing. Or the first section of this book, because he's not in like, I think part one all that much, but like kind of his part in like part two, part three, that kind of thing, was not quite into. But I loved him in this book. I thought he was super interesting, and I loved seeing his evolution over the course of the trilogy into where he ends up as well. And then the same thing with Vin, also, and Elend, and all the other characters, great in this book. Again, resolutions to all of these character arcs. The end of Vin's character arc is amazing. The end of Elend's arc is amazing. The end of Sazed's arc. Like, all the characters come to satisfying and enjoyable conclusions to their arcs in this book, which I really enjoyed. There's also I really enjoyed just reading this book in general. Like, all the stuff that was going on was interesting to me. It kind of, all three of these books feel a little different to me. Like, the first one is very much like the going to the royal balls and things like that, mixed with the training, mixed with the heist storyline. The second book's very much like political in nature, very much focused on like the siege of Luthadel, and also kind of figuring out the world's mysteries and things like that. And this book, like, the world's ending, like, things are bad, and everybody's kind of scrambling to figure out how to not make that happen, and fix the world and everything, make things, not be terrible anymore. So I love just seeing the way things are going in this book, like the different like parts that kind of built on each other in order to make this book happen. I thought was really fun to read. I also love the end of this book. Of course, I'm not going to get into spoilers. And I already talked about like the character arcs and things like that, but the end of this book in general just feels big and epic in scope. It feels almost, to me reading this, if I were to give again like another small like little thing that I didn't quite land for me, I do think the end of this book, like in terms of the way that it goes, in terms of the scope of the characters, like the way that some of the characters end up, I'm particularly, in this case, actually thinking of Vin, just felt a little weird to me, the transition of that, if that makes sense. It's hard for me to kind of talk around this so I don't spoil, but the way that the end of this book worked with her in particular felt a little weird to me, but I think it also was really cool and really interesting, and a very big and epic way to end the book in this trilogy. So I kind of, feel like it wasn't quite what I feel like it should have, like it didn't work as well as I feel like it could have, but it also was still really cool, so whatever. But and I also just love the way that this brings everything together. Like this book, resolves things that were set up all the way back in book one, things that were set up in book two, things that were set up in this particular book, and just the little hints of things that you pick up on across the trilogy, and especially in this book, were really cool. And I just had a blast reading this book. And another thing that I really like about this book especially, but even the entire trilogy, but it really kind of comes to a head in this book, is the way that something that I really like about the structure of the Mistborn series as a whole, not just this trilogy, but the entire series, even going into like Era 2, is like by the time Era 2 happens, the events of this trilogy are like mythology. And I love seeing that in this trilogy, and especially in this book. There are things in this book that happen where it's like, it feels like, the big epic backstory that you would hear about, happening hundreds of years ago or whatever. And I just think that's really cool. I really like the way that was done, kind of having that part of the story being told and then seeing the reaction to it later on. It's one of the big reasons why I'm excited to see how the world of Mistborn kind of goes along over time as we get into Era 3 and Era 4 and potentially Era 5 and all these things, all the different eras that may or may not be happening. So yeah, just a lot of really cool stuff with this book. I had a blast with it. Again, no big problems to speak of other than those two small things. And as I spoiled earlier, if I were to give this a rating out of 10, I would give it a 10 out of 10. I just had a blast with this book. I had a blast with this trilogy. I loved everything about it. Like, it was weird going back to this trilogy because even though I loved it the first time around, you know, there were still some things here and there that I was like not quite as into. And as I've read through the Cosmere, I've kind of really put the Stormlight Archive like right at the top. Like, this is the best thing that I have ever read, like ever. Those are my favorite books. And even though I would still probably put Stormlight above Mistborn Era 1, like, it's easily for me still like on that same kind of level now that I've reread these books. Like, just so good and so amazing, and I loved it all the way through. And especially also again with this book, just loved it all the way through and had a great time with this trilogy in general. So that's pretty much all I got to say about this one. Let me know in the comments if you have read The Hero of Ages and what you thought of it, and if you've read this trilogy in general, which obviously if you've read Hero of Ages, you've read this trilogy. Let me know what you thought of the whole trilogy in the comments. It's been a joy to revisit this series again. I have absolutely loved my time with it, and it has really kind of made me fall back in love with Mistborn Era 1 and really appreciate this story even more than I already did. And I just had a great time with it. So that's pretty much it for this video. So thank you all for watching, and I will see you all next time.